Okay, let's look into the Wiki article on ancient Egyptian race controversy. It has a lot of backing behind it, and there's a lot of conjecture that's made into this here a little bit. And I'd like to mention starting out, it tries to be somewhat vague and would leave probably, let's see, it would leave the black population thinking that there might have been some Negroids that weren't at all related to them whatsoever that were in Egypt, but they weren't much of a consequence. It would leave the Caucasians to believe everything that was believed since primordial time, that, of course, the Egyptians were Caucasians. It would also help to believe the people of northern Anatolia and Europe and things, a confirmation on the fact of where these people had eventually gone and what real stock they had originally come from. Let's look into this and see what it says, and I'll try my best to vamp over the top of it with some important information that correlates data. The question of the race of ancient Egyptians was raised historically as a product of the early racial concepts of the 18th and 19th centuries and was linked to models of racial hierarchy, primarily based on craniometry, which is the studying of skulls and the way people's heads look from each other and differences, anthropometry, and genetics. And genetics has really helped us a lot towards the end part of that and really kind of ended the conversation. But it still goes on today, as you see in my videos quite often. In fact, even after this information, you will see people down in the comments trying to berate Caucasians in some way or try to interject that somehow it had to do with Negroids. Some scholars argued that there was a variety of views circulated about the racial identity of the Egyptians and the source of their culture. Some scholars argued that ancient Egyptian culture was influenced by other Afro-Asiatic speaking populations in northeast Africa. So, looking at Libya and Berbers and the Phoenicians and things along that line, if you will, and Horn of African Caucasians. If you look up the definition of Caucasian race, it'll tell you that they were there in ancient times, and it's pretty much what they credit the current admix with now, but that has a lot to do with Arabic admix from the slave trade and so on. The Maghreb, which would be the other side of North Africa. In fact, all of North Africa was always Caucasians if you look at the Caucasian definition. All of North Africa, through Egypt, through the Horn of Africa, and really it was only sub-Saharan Africa that had the Negroids in it. But people try to change reality sometimes, and it's a terrible, weird whip of cuckling going on by a large group of people trying out of sympathy to let a heritage go that used to actually be definitely Caucasian. Well, why not just let them believe that? Well, if you saw what they get mad, hop up and down, and act like once they think they actually were the ancient Egyptians, you might not think that that's such a great idea. What is a great idea about telling West Africans who were primitives that they were somehow the far northeast African Caucasian pyramid builders is beyond me, especially whenever you see what happens out of it. So they could also come from the Middle Eastern area, of course, and a lot of the people connect to that in ancient Sumeria, and I've shown people many connections with ancient Sumeria, pre-dynastic and then early dynastic, and I believe they'll make a mention more than that little subtle hint right there of such a thing where and I'll show you some pictures at the end of this that'll also correlate some of the data. While others still pointed to influences from various Nubian groups, our populations may be in Europe. So it's had a lot of strange connections with a lot of different people. Of course, the Nubian one can easily be dismissed for they weren't a part, craniometry or anything whatsoever, with the ancient pre-dynastic Egyptians, it seems. And there apparently was one group, and they ended up later becoming called the Nubians and so on, that had interjected there. It was Nubian colony A, which pretty much got decimated out apparently because they weren't seen for almost 500 more years and then seen again at that point. But whenever they're seen again at that point and they find the skulls and stuff of the dead ones that they had found from the wars and interactions they had with them, that they had changed quite a bit. They were no longer a proto-Negroid, but more of a modern-looking Negroid. And so conjecture was made that these were totally different people, or that a change had been made somehow, or maybe there was some interjection, or who knows. Did they capture some of these people's women, and somehow that made an admix to these people? What had happened there? But so there's Nubian A and Nubian C, and quite different. When we looked and studied into it from that time till now, the oldest modern Negroid skull that we can find is 4600 BC at Asalar 4600 max peg, and the oldest proto-Negroid skull that we can find is about 9100 BC. And so it kind of shows that Negroids weren't already to a modern evolutionary point, even at the point they were interjected upon in Nubia. And this has nothing to do with the West Africans and Bantus, Congoids, nor the Khoisan or anything either, which are definitely separate groups of people and not some blanket like people try to think of in their mind somehow. In more recent times, Afrocentric writers continued to challenge the mainstream view, some focusing on questioning the race of specific notable individuals. Like, oh, if we can find one, then it destroys the whole thing. That's what you see a lot of times in videos, is they'll try to find a dark or even a photoshopped picture and show it to people and try to get them to believe that, hey, this was West African Negroes somehow. And in doing so, a lot of times in those same pictures, like what's seen before in a debunk video I did 4-7 Phoenician 7, or recently about radio trying to do some crap, and then he made videos about me, which tried to say that because I didn't make YouTube videos, I never studied, indicating that he doesn't have a decent logical mind in his brain whatsoever. And he seemed to be extremely happy about the fact that he thought that if no one had made a YouTube video, they never studied preemptive to that point. Like Carl Sagan's Cosmos, he didn't know what he was talking about till the first episode, and he just started talking and studying then. It's a strange thing that he was able to put into his mind, and I'm not sure how many of the Negroids that go along with his yap actually believed in it, but I would believe, due to a strong hatred towards Caucasian and white people, that they're willing to believe anything at this point. And because of their not wanting to be associated with West African primitives and people that captured and sold them themselves off as unwanted for beads and alcohol, like a drive-through slave mart to other people coming up from the Islamic slave trade that began 900 years or more before the Americas were even found, and so on. Most of those were castrated, though. That they don't want to be associated with those people anymore. They really definitely want to be associated with the Caucasian Egyptians, and a lot of them also want to try to be associated with people out of the Bible. Yeah, it's hard to explain how they try to put it together. Anciently, people tried to say that Ham's son Canaan was cursed to be a Negro somehow. Of course, who would he marry? You know, and it just falls apart right there. He would make a mulatto. We'd never be able to make these people that are over there. And they tried to use that to justify slavery. If you look up Hamites, it'll tell you it's a division of the Caucasian race, and that they used the idea in the Islamic slave trade as an idea that they must be the cursed people that we're talking about. And from that, so hell yeah, they're servants of servants, and so they misused it. But let's continue. They like to take notable individuals such as the king represented in the Great Sphinx of Giza, which most people believe the Sphinx is Khafre, and you can match his face up to it. It does pretty well. Of course, with the nose gone, it looks like very prognostic or underslung jaw, and because Negroids know that they have an underslung jaw, unlike all of the art of all of the Egyptians, they try to cop out to that moment, which is kind of real telling. But of course, if anybody had any sense on stonework, it couldn't be under cleft jaw because it would all fall apart. That there has to be a cantilevering of an entire plateau where the rest of the head can set on. regardless of that fact, if you take and match it up, it matches up to Khafre's head, and he doesn't really have any prognathism whatsoever. And so we now have a duality of thought and another way of trying to somehow interject Negroids into having something to do with ancient Egypt. And Negroids did, as far as Nubia goes, they were called vile Nubian troglodytes and not even allowed into Egypt by quite a few decrees. The Simna Stele of Sensuret the Third, try to say that 5 times fast, easily shows it. If you look at the one that was done in the 6th year of his reign, it vehemently says they are banned and cannot come even into Egypt whatsoever. There are other ones that say that there are bounties on their heads, which is really their right hands. They don't want them. It's worth more than a slave brought to them would be worth. And it shows that they do not want them whatsoever. Everybody thought the pyramids were built by slaves, and no, it was built by the endemic population pretty much. And they were paid quite well. A lot of this has been shown. They ran out of their sunblock makeup stuff and even had what's recorded as probably the first strike ever, but people have to look over all of this knowledge and things that have accrued and still go back. And what black people like to do is take old recantations of older stuff, some will be mentioned here, and try to interject, well, that's the way it really is. Whenever those people were seeing Adamics people and, of course, Arabics and all kinds of things in the area that weren't there that started Egypt and heralded through or built pyramids or anything. So they'll tell you that there's specific individuals like the great Sphinx of Giza, native Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun, which is hilarious for them to choose, and Greek Ptolemaic Queen Cleopatra even. And you've seen this a lot. They claim Cleopatra, they claim Nefertiti, and it's easily seen by anybody who has any type of inkling and isn't trying to delude themselves that those last 2 women are definitely Caucasian. And Nefertiti even has a blue eye left in her. I'll try to show you a picture of her later, but Cleopatra's Greek, for Christ's sake, and they still tried to claim that. Yeah, and some still try to claim it to this day, and then they go, oh, well, not them, but everybody else was. And as they get picked away to where they don't have anything, then they just get mad and start saying things like whites are Neanderthals and stuff, trying to berate them into being a caveman or a primitive people from 30, 40,000 years ago to be a comparison to something that they were found just recently. And that gets disgusting too. And you talk about racism in America and you wonder where it comes from, and a lot of it stems from jealousy, greed, and lying, and a desperate want to be associated with a Caucasian civilization rather than their own, and it's by their own hands. Let's continue so I can get through some of this. I'd like it to be a one-parter. Mainstream scholars reject the notion that Egypt was a white or black civilization. They maintain that despite the phenotypic diversity of ancient and present-day Egyptians, applying modern notions of black or white races to ancient Egypt is anachronistic. In addition, scholars reject the notion, implicit in the notion of a black or white Egypt hypothesis, that ancient Egypt was racially homogeneous. Instead, skin color varied between the peoples of Lower Egypt, Upper Egypt, and Nubia, of course, who were in various eras rose to power in ancient Egypt. And people try to claim that Nubia rose to power in ancient Egypt finally in the late 25th dynasty after not being even allowed into it and had to trade it Icon and such, is what's shown on the walls. But in reality, that was actually a Kushite dynasty, and if we look at a lot of their statues there, even though it does show some Negroid features trying to, because they were the kind of the overlords or governors over these people in some way. They had taken them under their wing, if you will, and that also doesn't mean that they are a Negroid population, but that they are actually under that, which Nubia was always under subjugation to the Egyptians and were domesticated from that point. There's a lot of clear written in stone documents relating to such that people try to avoid whenever they like to lie. A study published in 2017 described the extraction an analysis of DNA from 151 mummified ancient Egyptian individuals from an old burial ground, a necropolis, whose remains were recovered from Abu Sir el Melek in the Cairo government. The study was able to measure the mitochondrial DNA of 90 individuals, and it showed that ancient Egyptians had the greatest affinity for modern Middle Eastern, which is Arab, Levantine, and Anatolian populations, and had significantly more affinity with Southern Eastern Europeans than with any Sub-Saharan Africans. Genome-wide data could only be successfully extracted from 3 of these individuals, though, out of the group that most of the percentages they did get DNA data out of, which was confirmation, but to pull the entire genome, they got it out of 3 individuals. Of these 3, the Y chromosome haplogroups of 2 individuals could be assigned to the Middle Eastern haplogroup J, and 1 to haplogroup E1B1B1, which is it's still real common in North Africa and connects to Caucasians. And from what I understand about genetics, people have had to try to go around that because black people try to claim it, that have admix from people from that area, and therefore try to claim that they were suddenly somehow the Caucasian Libyans of old. The absolute estimates of sub-Saharan African ancestry in these 3 individuals was ranged from 6 to 15%, which is significantly lower than the level of sub-Saharan African ancestry in the modern Egyptians from Abu Sir, who range from 14 to 21%. The authors cautioned that the mummies may be unrepresentative of the ancient Egyptian population as a whole, though, since they were recovered from the northern part of Egypt in the middle ancient burial ground, as opposed to maybe some more burials that are up farther north, but that would also indicate a racial mix going on there that wasn't around the places where all the pyramids were built and so on. And they really are trying to be careful not to offend people as they slowly smooth into it here. Since they were recovered from the northern part of Egypt, closer to foreign populations of Caucasians, and they only dated from the late Newer period all the way through to the Roman period. As a result, mummies from the earlier classical periods of Egyptian history, such as the Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom, further to the south, were omitted, and not that they had them 100%. This was just what the test that was done, so you could see somebody trying to put that flavor on it again. And the concept here too that they were trying to find people was that they wanted to see the ancient Egyptians through the years of conquest and see if they could detect when the people came in and see their genetics and see the slight variation that put on it. If they were able to do so, they could correlate that with ancient genetic data that they had of these people and put it all together, and ta-da! The problem is it was a fail, that they showed to be primordial Caucasians all the way through until into the Roman period. And that's whenever they started having a lot more influx of Negroid admix and so on, and that it wasn't there from before. And so all these people that saw later were getting this misinformation visually about what was going on. So let's look into this a little bit. The history. The earliest examples of disagreement regarding the race of ancient Egyptians occurred in the work of Europeans and Americans early in the 19th century. Whoopsie. One early example, and this was also a cuckling of slavery and trying to prop up black people like that was done with George Washington Carver and so on. Strangely, things clicked with me somewhat on that idea, because one year I was given a book report thing to do after Red Badge of Courage, I think it was, or something, and it said that the Civil War people and far before in America had lived off Johnny cakes and peanut butter, and it was clearly noted in there. Yet then they say George Washington Carver. Next year I had to do a report on Carver, and it said they invented peanut butter, but in the report I noted that, ta-da, there's peanut butter before that, though, so apparently it was a false statement. The teacher didn't like that at all. And whenever I explained it to her, she didn't like that either, and she said that someone had made a mistake. It was a black teacher. Let's continue. One early example of such was an article published in the New England Magazine of October 1833, where the authors dispute a claim that Herodotus was given authority for them being Negroes. And to this day, we still have an argument on whether the correct transportation of the language does not say dark and curly-haired, rather than black and woolly-haired, which really doesn't correlate to negroid and nappy-haired, but they try to. Listen, it's an idea that some negroid somewhere did something, and then try to claim it as being we're related, even though they're nowhere anyway related to any of these people they're trying to relate themselves to. If it was found that they were negroids, they would not be related to the West African primitives that are trying to claim it. They would not be related to the Ethiopians that are up above it now either. That's a different admix. And if you look up the definition of Ethiopia and click on the Greek form of it, it'll show you, because they're the ones that made up that word, and it's in the Bible and everything. And so when they talk about Ethiopians, they're all over the place. Yeah. Even though they deny it. In fact, what's funny is Radio, in that recent video he did, denied the fact that Ethiopians were only here because it says it in that one picture. But I was mentioning right there that all the brown areas were where they called Ethiopia, and there was even in India. Seven Phoenician, Seven, being familiar with his work somewhat, went back and grabbed the part where he talks about Ethiopians over there being, in India and different places, but then but he tries to dismiss it. So he knew it. And then in my video where he tries to debunk me, he says that it doesn't exist. It's hilarious. It's a disconnect. They know that it logically can't fit together, and then again they can't think good enough to keep the lie up, so it just collapses. Let's continue. They point out, with reference to the tomb paintings, it may be observed that the complexion of the men is invariably red or red ochre, and that the women are a tan or yellow color, but neither of them can be said to have anything in their physiognomy at resembling the Negro countenance. No, in fact, whenever they see the Negro on the wall, they look like Negroes, and they're always painted darker and black. Of course, the only blacks that are interacting with these Caucasian Egyptians at this point are Nilotics, and they are extremely dark, you can see to this day. And no, that's not Egyptians, that's Nubians, and they'll never be called Egyptians. If a Nubian came and stood in Egypt, it's, hey, look, there's a Nubian in Egypt. It's kind of like the African American situation. Let's continue. In the 18th century, Constantin Francois de Chalabouf, Comte de Volnay, wrote the Copts are about the proper representatives of the ancient Egyptians, due to their jaundiced and fumed skin, which is neither Greek, Negro, or Arab, their full faces, their puffy eyes, and their crushed noses, and their thick lips. So he's describing now what you see there then, as opposed to what possibly could have been there before. We easily can see that now. And he's telling you that jaundiced, fumed skin, so on. So these people are tanned quite well. Of course, Constantine de is pale and puts powder on and things at this time too. And of course, here we see in action a disconnect with his own Caucasian edict. For the edict of the time was, for his time, for nobility to all stay pale because they don't have to work. That's peasant stuff. Peasants get tan working out in the sun. Whenever we look at Egyptian art, you see the same thing, where men are doing the action and women don't have to anymore due to the fact that they're farmers and all these advanced things that Caucasians brought to the world. And in all of their art back from this time, they show you red ochre men and pale women in Mitanni, Greek, Minoan art, all the whole area, all the Caucasians, and ones you can say are pale as hell are still not drawn pale as hell in any way, shape, or form as the males, and females sometimes not either, but more often than not are drawn extremely pale. Sometimes a woman in action is not drawn pale, i.e. Amazon type concept and things like that. And it shows you a caste system that's built out of coloration of people's skin of just Caucasians, and then later somehow applied to the idea of slavery, and then now falsely applied to the idea that there could be a Negro in Egypt, and especially a West African. Let's continue. Just a few years later, in 1939, Jean-François Champollion, you like my French, stated in his work Egypte Ancienne, which is Ancient Egypt, that the Egyptians and Nubians are represented in the same manner in tomb paintings and relief, further suggesting that the Copts of Egypt, we do not find any of the characteristic features of the ancient Egyptian population. The Copts are the result of crossbreeding with all nations that successfully dominated Egypt. It is wrong to see them in the principal features of the old race. So this guy here, upon hearing that, says, no, look up history. They all crossed and went into there, and the Arabic people aren't the people that were there before. But everybody's got their own ideas right now, and start to go, Also in 1839, Chapon and Volney's claims were disputed by Jacques-Joseph Champollion-Figurac, who blamed the ancients for spreading a false impression of a Negro Egypt, stating that the opinion that the ancient Egyptian population belonged to the Negro African race is an error long accepted as the truth. Volney's conclusion as the Negro origin of the ancient Egyptian civilization is evidently forced and unadmissible. And so whenever Herodotus had wrote upon that, he was seeing some type of admixed people there and somehow trying to relate that to being the ancient Egyptians too. But he also an Ethiopians in this concept, but he also talks about, there's two different interpretations you can give this, but the ancient Garamantes or Egyptian warriors hunt the vile Negro troglodytes or Ethiopian troglodytes. They are the fastest afoot of any that they have ever seen, so they hunt them in 4-horse chariots, which of course is a Caucasian thing. They eat snakes, lizard, and other crawling things, and their speech is very unique and like the screeching of bats when caught. People have taken this to maybe mean the Khoisan people who have that weird click language and sounds like clicking of bats and so on. But let's continue. That still doesn't mean that those were the Egyptians. And of course, most of Herodotus' stuff is hearsay. He talks about giant ants in India collecting gold and cattle with such big horns they have to walk backwards right over there in North Africa. So it's nowadays seen as he was the father of histories, but also the father of hearsay, because literally in most of his work, if you'll look closely, he says these people say, and those say, and these say they were the first of all men because of blah blah blah. And then he kind of recants maybe how he could see how that might work, because people thought that everybody came from the sun, and people closer to the sun would have been the people from the earlier time. And of course this is perhaps seeing a memory and a consciousness still of the ancient ice age and how it had come out and the people around the sun and blended out from there. Maybe it happened from around the equator, although they didn't know the equator could be passed at that point. In fact, he dismissed the claims of the Phoenicians seeing the sun on the other side of their boat as being some type of foolish conjecture, whenever the reality is that at a certain time of year, if you were to go, like say summer, if you were to go all the way to south and go around Africa, which if you look at Herodotus' maps doesn't exist at all, if you were to go way down there and go around, you would have passed the equator by far, and you could see the sun more on this side of your boat than on that side of your boat. If you were looking straight up as what's noon, it'd have been over here a little bit. And so apparently the Phoenicians tried to relate some of this information to people that took hundreds and hundreds of years later to totally find out. Those amazing Caucasian Phoenicians. Let's continue. Forced and inadmissible. The debate over the race of ancient Egyptians intensified during the 19th century movement to abolish slavery in the United States. Change then. As the arguments relating to the justifications for slavery increasingly assert the historical, mental, and physical inferiority of black people, For example, in 1851, John Campbell directly challenged the claims by Champion and others regarding the evidence for a black Egypt, asserting that there is one great difficulty, and to my mind an unsurmountable one, which is that the advocates of the Negro civilization of Egypt do not attempt to account for how the civilization was lost. Egypt progressed continually. And why? Well, because it was Caucasian. One of his statements. The arguments regarding the race of the Egyptians became more explicitly tied to the debate over slavery in the United States as the United States escalates towards civil war. In 1854, Josiah C. Nott with George Glidden set out to prove that the Caucasian are white and the Negro races were distinct at a very remote date, and that the Egyptians were Caucasians. So he could see the ancient Nubians and the ancient that, and these people are totally different. Quit claiming those people are these people. It was a simple ease to see this. Samuel George Morton, a physician and professor of anatomy, concluded that although Negroes were numerous in Egypt, but their social position in ancient times was the same as that it is now in the United States, or then, of servants and slaves. In the early 20th century, Flinders Petrie, a professor of Egyptology, quite famous, at the University of London, in turn spoke of a Nubian queen, Ahomez Nefertari, who was the divine ancestress of the 18th dynasty. He described her physically, though, as having an alkaline nose, thin and long chin, and was a type not of the least prognathous. That wouldn't be a Negroid then. At best, we're looking at an admixed Negroid like you might find up in East Africa today in Ethiopia, but that's a more modern thing. Hopefully people understand that concept quite easily. Egypt was not a popular civilization with all African Americans even at the time, because they often associated Egypt with slavery, and that they had made black people somehow build the pyramids while they sat around and didn't do anything, which is really a reverse conjecture. Black spirituals such as Go Down Moses related the slavery of blacks in America to the bondage of the Israelites in Egypt. As late as the 1960s, Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders related the struggles of the Jews enslaved in Egypt to the struggles of African Americans. And disgustingly nowadays, we have another group of, not the Egyptian blacks, but the Hebrew blacks, where they wear clown suits, stand on street corners, and yell at white people that they're not actually part of their own religion, that it really was a black people's religion somehow, even though they didn't have writing, and it was the book of the Jewish slave master. If you want to talk about getting disgusting, now we have these two competing for, oh, hold my beer. I can make us look more foolish than you. So let's continue a little more here. Position of modern scholarship. Modern scholars have studied ancient Egyptian culture and population history and have responded to the controversy over the race of ancient Egyptians in different ways. Zahi Hawass himself said that any inclination of a black or a Negroid Egypt was a lie right in front of everybody at a press conference whenever he kept getting pressed for the idea here recently. But at UNESCO's symposium on the peopling of ancient Egypt and the deciphering of the Meroitic script in Cairo way back in 1974, the black hypothesis met with profound disagreement. Most participants concluded that the ancient Egyptian population was indigenous to the Nile Valley and was made up of people from north and south of the Sahara who were differentiated by their color, i.e. being tan, pale, and so on, as we all see in the pictures over there at the right. The arguments for all sides are recorded in the UNESCO publication General History of Africa, with the origin of the Egyptians chapter being written by Sheikh Anta who has now, of course, been totally discredited as being a Negrocentric who tried to get people to believe that the Senegalese were the ancient pyramid builders, and somehow after building the pyramids, they ran over there, became primitive, and got caught into slavery, and then didn't do anything after that, except for claim Egypt, kind of like the West African primitives are now. Since the second half of the 20th century, most anthropologists have rejected the notion of race as having any validity in the study of human biology, so totally trying to dismiss the concept of there being different races. Although we have different subraces of dogs that we can see, and they serve different purposes and come from different lineages, it's very racist to say that there's any difference between a Negroid and a Caucasian, or European type, and maybe a Japanese person. Right. No, there's quite a bit of difference. There's different histories. There's different things that went on. It's well documented, and we're not going to blur that and go, oh, they're all just people. No. They're all humans on the planet, but certain ones of them actually did a lot of these incredible works. And from what I hear, they can fly now, and they even went up into space and to the moon and back. Meanwhile, back in Africa, they're relying still, in sub-Saharan Africa mainly, they're relying on Caucasian money, and for a few dollars you can help too, in Ethiopia, and all those things that we grew up with all the way to this day. And so we can probably see the capability of people and what goes on. You can definitely tell whenever the sub-Saharan farmers kill the white farmers off and run them out, and then try to keep it controlled by themselves, it all falls apart. The water supply actually for down in the Cape there pretty much almost failed due to their own lack of any maintenance. You can see that in their own neighborhoods. But let's just continue. Cheap anti-diop and deoperation failed. Since the second half of the 20th century, most anthropologists have rejected the notion of race as having any validity. Stuart Tyson Smith writes in 2001 Oxford Encyclopedia of Ancient Egypt, any characterization of race of the ancient Egyptians depends on modern cultural definitions, not on scientific studies. Yet we go on scientific studies and can easily tell which race these people were from, and from this point this man's talking about. So he's trying to say, well, now that we're 2,000 years later, we all just go blur, blur, blah, blah. And it's like, no, actually, study gets better and better and better in science. And if you think that's the way science works, then you need to go sit over there. Thank you for your time. Thus, by modern American standards, it is reasonable to characterize the Egyptians as black, while acknowledging the scientific evidence for the physical diversity of Africans. That's what he says, but in actuality what he meant is there's black people that try to call it black, but it doesn't have anything to do with Negroids whatsoever, and you can still acknowledge the Caucasian presence there in some way. It's just an odd statement. Frank M. Snowden, asserts Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans attached no special stigma to the color of their skin and developed no hierarchical notions of race, whereby highest and lowest positions in the social pyramid were based on color. And I'm about to debunk the hell out of that in the video, because you're talking that they didn't necessarily discredit people that were a little more tan or swarthy than them. It's not going to be this, oh, Negroids are running around lollygagging all day. It never happened. And so to try to take and make up a story like that, and then to get West Africans to believe that, oh, we was in Rome and everybody liked us. No. So you can see where things like this lead, and why it causes a problem by their own hands. In 1975, an important study was done. The mummy of Ramses II was taken to France for preservation techniques. The mummy was also forensically tested by Professor Pierre Fernand Secaldi, the chief forensic scientist at the Criminal Identification Laboratory of Paris. He wrote, hair astonishingly preserved showed some complementary data, especially about pigmentation. Ramses II was a red-haired Simotric leucoderma. Leucoderma is a fair-skinned person with wavy red hair, but leucoderma is just a pale skin, leuco, and being derm. Vitiligo is a sign of leucoderma, where a black person can get it, but I guarantee you now, oh no, I showed this picture. Now black people are going to say all white people are black people with leukoderma, or that they're somehow albino negroids. Oh yeah, we've seen that one too before. It's disgusting. It's also now agreed that the dynastic Egyptians were indigenous to the Nile area about 5,000 years ago. The Sahara dried out, and the Green Sahara Project shows Caucasians. And part of the indigenous Sahara population retreated east towards the Nile Valley. In addition, peoples from the Middle East entered the Nile Valley, bringing with them wheat, barley, sheep, goats, and possibly cattle. This is the subtle inclination of the Anatolian influx into Egypt, creating pre-dynastic Egypt, and the Sumerians, who had done so already probably previously and into this point once, and then does it again early in the dynastic period. And you can see that with the followers of Shemsu Hora. I've done videos about pre-dynastic Egypt that shows you the cave art and the symbology that goes along with it, how there's so much Sumerian connections going on. It's just unreal. The Master of Beasts and things along that line. Even the Horus statue itself and the falcon god that's at the Tree of Life comes from a Sumerian thing. But let's continue here. Dynastic Egyptians refer to their country as the two lands, and so it was itself put together, was not one, and they knew so. And it was hard to keep together, and they had periods of times in the intermediate periods where it broke apart into two and back into one. People like to think of it as this long. No, it's not. Doesn't work that way, and it goes over so many thousands of years, that it went through its ebbs and flows. During the pre-dynastic period, about 4800 to 4300 BC, the Mermaid culture flourished in the northern part of Egypt, or Lower Egypt. This culture, among the others, has links to the Levant in the Middle East. The pottery of the Buto Mahdi culture, best known from the site at Mahdi, which is where they get their name, near Cairo, also shows connections to the southern Levant. And the southern part of Egypt, or Upper Egypt, Upper Egypt is higher up the river, down the river, and so on our map it looks backwards, but it's the way it works. The pre-dynastic Badarian culture was followed by the Naqada culture. These people seem to be more closely related to the Nubians than to the northern Egyptians, they try to say, but in reality, the Naqada culture had phenotypes that they show in their own art to be Caucasian, with a lot of blue eye insets and so on like that. In fact, to finish off the last couple of minutes into the 45-minute run, let's just take a look at that, if we will. Ancient Race Controversy of Egypt. So now let's look at some of the earliest pictures of ancient Egypt. And I'm going to go with some important figures and people that are well known if you know about Egypt, and pre-dynastic early Egyptians. Here we see Nefertiti, and her blue eye is the same color as her hat. She is missing one eye, but I right now am as dark as her skin is. It's not showing up in the light. But yeah, and I haven't been out in the sun at all, really, people. Mitri, scribe from the 6th dynasty, I believe, and this is back when they had these crystal inset blue eyes. It was just incredible. And the inset rims around their eyes that they did for them, the way they inserted them into statues, which also is the same technique used in Sumeria, same rim and everything, just not polished crystalline eyes, just solid lapis lazuli is what's used over there. And that's what the trim is and everything is in Egyptians too, and where they got it from. Here's King Hor himself, and he has blue eyes. They oddly change from blue to gray as you move around the room, and they seem to follow you somewhat. It's an amazing technique that they had. And sure, there are people that are there now that can show this extreme rare trait where they pull off blue eyes, and I think it looks incredible. And there's also another picture of a girl that's there that's somewhat the same ethnicity as this man, if not a little more, white Caucasian, if you will. And she has these weird blue-green eyes. She tries to sell postcards. I've shown it in a video recently, and you see it whenever